The gunshot cracked across the mesa just as the sun broke pink over the Sangre de Cristo foothills, and Margaret Easton was already reaching for her rifle before she understood why. She had been standing on the porch of the ranch house with a cup of chicory coffee going cold in her hand, watching the spring mist lift off the grass, when the second shot came, closer, and then the drum of a horse pushed past its limit. The animal came over the rise with its head low and its flanks lathered white, and the rider slumped so far forward in the saddle that, for a moment, Margaret thought the horse was riderless, a ghost horse running from something only it could see. "Open the gate," she shouted, and Consuelo Ruiz dropped the basket of eggs she was carrying and ran for the corral rail while Margaret vaulted off the porch steps with her skirts bunched in one fist and the rifle in the other. The horse nearly went down at the gate, stumbling on its forelegs, and the rider slid rather than dismounted, landing hard in the dirt. It was Jed Whitfield, one of the young hands she had sent out 3 days before to carry word to the ranches strung along the Rio Verde about the meeting in Alma Springs. He was 17 years old and gray in the face, and there was a dark stain spreading through his shirt at the shoulder that had gone past red into black. "Miss Easton," he gasped, and his hand closed around her wrist with a strength that surprised her. "They're coming, Vance's men. They know about the—" His eyes rolled and his grip went slack, and for one terrible heartbeat Margaret thought he had died right there in the dirt of her own dooryard. Jed, stay with me." She got her arm under his shoulders and looked up to find Consuelo already running for water and clean cloth, already shouting for her husband Refugio to bring the wagon around. What about the election? What did they know? But Jed Whitfield had gone past hearing her, his breath coming shallow and quick, and whatever warning he had ridden 3 miles at a dead run to deliver was going to have to wait until they got the bleeding stopped. It was Refugio who spotted the riders first, 4 of them cresting the same rise Jed had come over, moving at an easy trot that was somehow more menacing than a charge would have been, as though they knew they had all the time they needed. "Margaret." Refugio's voice was low and urgent. He had been her father's foreman for 11 years and hers for the 3 since her father's heart had finally quit on him in the middle of a spring branding, and in all that time she had rarely heard him sound afraid. "Those are Vance riders. I know the buckskin. That is Coy Dalton's horse." Margaret looked down at Jed, unconscious now in Consuelo's arms, and then out at the 4 riders drawing closer, and made the calculation she had learned to make in 3 years of holding this ranch together with her own hands and her father's debts and nothing else. There was no time to send for the sheriff in Alma Springs, 6 miles distant. There was no time to do anything but stand her ground on the only piece of earth she had left that still felt like home. "Refugio, get your rifle. Manuel, up on the barn roof, and do not fire unless I fire first." She checked the loads in her own Winchester with hands that she was proud to see were not shaking, not yet anyway. "We are not going to let them see they have frightened us." The 4 riders reined up at the edge of the yard, close enough that Margaret could see the man in front clearly. Coy Dalton, foreman to Cornelius Vance, a big man running to fat in the belly but not in the arms, with a face like a slab of raw beef and small eyes that moved over the ranch yard, over Margaret with her rifle held easy across her body, over the boy bleeding in the Mexican woman's arms, and did not seem troubled by any of it. "Morning, Miss Easton." Dalton's voice carried the false courtesy of a man who enjoyed having power over people who could not stop him from using it. "Heard you had some excitement out this way." "I heard the same, mister." "Dalton, seeing as one of your men put a bullet in my hired boy." Dalton's smile did not move. "Now that is a serious accusation. We are just riding fence, ma'am, looking for strays. On my land. Free range, last I heard. Leastways until the election settles who says different." He let that sit a moment, let it land the way he wanted it to land. "Speaking of which, might be a friendly word of advice, seeing as you're a woman alone out here trying to run cattle. Man like Mr. Vance, man who wins this county commissioner seat, he's going to remember who stood with him and who stood against. Water rights get decided by men in offices, Miss Easton, not by who's got the prettiest herd. I will take my chances with the voters of this county, Mr. Dalton, same as everyone else. Margaret let her thumb rest, visible, along the hammer of her rifle, and I will take it very unkindly if any more of Mr. Vance's men come riding through my gate uninvited. You tell him that. For a long moment nobody moved. Manuel, up on the barn roof with his rifle, was a still gray shape against the brightening sky. Refugio stood at Margaret's shoulder with his jaw set like stone. And Coy Dalton looked at the three of them, did his own calculation, and apparently decided that 4 men against a woman with steady hands, an old vaquero with nothing left to lose, and an unseen rifle on the roofline was not good enough odds for a fight he did not need to have this particular morning. No offense meant, ma'am. He touched his hat, an insolent little gesture. You have yourself a fine morning. They wheeled their horses and rode off the way they had come, unhurried, and it was not until the dust of them had settled behind the rise that Margaret let herself breathe out the long breath she had been holding, and only then did her hand begin, finally, to shake. Jed Whitfield did not die. Consuelo and old Dr. Prout, fetched at a gallop by Refugio's youngest son, worked the bullet free of his shoulder by mid-afternoon, and by evening he was conscious enough to finish the warning he had ridden 3 miles to deliver, his voice thin but steady in the lamplight of the ranch house's back bedroom. They mean to steal the election, Miss Easton, not just scare folks off voting. I heard 2 of them talking at the Alma Springs livery, thought I was asleep in the hayloft. They mean to take the ballot boxes, when they're carried through Canyon and Gosto, to the county seat for counting. Swap them for boxes already marked for Vance's man, or burn the real ones in the canyon where nobody would ever find the ash. And the sheriff. Jed's eyes slid away from hers, which told her most of what she needed to know before he even said the words. I do not think Sheriff Hollies is one of them, ma'am. I think he is just scared to cross Mr. Vance. Vance holds the note on half the town. Margaret sat with that a long while after Jed had drifted back into an exhausted sleep, sitting on the porch in the dark with a shawl around her shoulders, and the spring peepers loud in the arroyo below the house. 11 days until the election. 11 days to get her herd through the last of the spring gathering and branding without Vance's men running it off or worse, and somehow also help see to it that an honest count of ballots made it through the one narrow pass that connected Alma Springs to anywhere that mattered. She had 4 hands on the ranch, counting Refugio, and one of them lying shot in her back bedroom. She had a herd of 900 head that needed protecting through gathering season on land. 3 separate rival outfits would happily see her lose. And she admitted to herself in the cold clarity of that dark porch, exactly one idea of where to find help that might actually be equal to what was coming. She had heard 3 weeks back from a drover passing through with a string of remounts that Amos Covington had come back to New Mexico territory and was working horses for the Army remount station outside Cimarron, gentling green stock that other men had given up on. She had not let herself think much about that news at the time. She let herself think about it now. She found him 2 days later, having ridden the 18 miles to the remount station with Refugio as escort, and a story ready about needing horses broke for her spring roundup, which was true enough as far as it went even if it was not the whole truth of why she had come. He was in the round pen when she arrived, and for a moment Margaret simply sat her horse at the fence and watched, because she had forgotten, or made herself forget, what it looked like when Amos Covington worked. The horse in the pen was a big, rangy buckskin gelding with wild eyes and a scar across its withers that told its own story of some past cruelty, and it was tearing around the enclosure like the devil himself was after it, throwing its head, slamming its own shoulder into the rails hard enough that Margaret winced from 30 feet away. Amos stood in the center of the pen doing nothing at all, or nothing that looked like anything, just standing with his weight easy on both feet and his hat pushed back, and his whole body turned very slightly away from the horse's line of sight, patient as a stone in a riverbed, letting the animal run itself past the worst of its own fear. He had changed in 8 years. He was still lean, still moved with that particular economy she remembered, but there was gray now at his temples that had no business being there on a man of 31, and a stillness to him that had not been there before, a watchfulness that made her think of a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, exactly how much the world could take from a person and had decided not to be surprised by it anymore. The buckskin slowed, circled, slowed more. And then, in the space of about 4 minutes that felt to Margaret like watching some private miracle, the horse came down to a walk, then a stop, then took 2 hesitant steps toward the motionless man in the center of the pen and lowered its great ugly head until its nose nearly touched Amos Covington's outstretched palm. "There you are," Amos said, so quiet Margaret almost did not hear it. "There you are, then. Nobody is going to hurt you here." He looked up and saw her at the fence, and something crossed his face that was not quite surprise, because Amos Covington did not startle easy, but was something close to it, an old door swinging open on hinges that had gone stiff with disuse. "Margaret Easton." He said her name slowly, like he was testing whether it still fit in his mouth the way it used to. "I heard you'd taken over your father's outfit. I heard you'd taken to killing men for money." The words came out sharper than she intended, 8 years of unresolved feeling finding an outlet she had not planned on. Or was that just a story the drovers tell? Something shuddered behind his eyes. He came to the rail slow, unhurried, the buckskin trailing him like a dog now that it had decided he was safe. "I hired on as a range detective for the Ellison outfit up in Colorado. There were rustlers running stock across the Purgatoire that had already killed 2 line riders. It went the way those things go sometimes." He met her eyes without flinching, and she saw the cost of it sitting behind his gaze, plain as a brand. "I am not proud of the men who are dead because of me, Margaret. I have never once been proud of it. But I did not come back to New Mexico territory to answer for my whole life's account to anybody, least of all standing at a fence." She had forgotten how directly he spoke, how he never dressed a hard truth up in softer clothes to make it easier to hear. It disarmed her the way it always had. "I did not ride out here to judge you, Amos." She dismounted, handed her reins to Refugio without looking away from Amos's face. "I rode out here because I need a man who is not afraid of Cornelius Vance, and everyone in 3 counties tells me you are the best there is with horses that have been ruined by fear, and I begin to think those 2 things might be the same skill." That got the ghost of something from him, not quite a smile. "You want me to gentle your cattle. I want you to guard my herd through gathering season, and I will pay you union scale plus board, and I am not going to pretend to you that it ends with the herd." She told him then, standing at that corral fence with the buckskin gelding watching them both with its great dark patient eyes, everything Jed Whitfield had told her. The ballot boxes, the pass at Canyon Angosto, the sheriff too frightened of a mortgage to do his duty, the 11 days that were now down to 9. Amos listened without interrupting, the way he had always listened, and when she finished, he was quiet a long moment, looking off toward the mountains where the pass cut its narrow line between 2 shoulders of gray rock. "You know I left Alma Springs 8 years ago because your father told me I would never be good enough to court his daughter on a horse trainer's wage, and I did not have it in me to argue with a man who was right about the wage part, even if he was wrong about the rest of it. He said it plainly, no self-pity in it, just a fact laid down between them like a card on a table. I went and got myself a reputation instead. Turns out that was not the improvement I was hoping for. My father has been dead 3 years, Amos. I am sorry for it. He was a hard man, but he was not a bad one." He looked at her then, really looked, and Margaret felt it the way she had felt it 8 years before, that particular attention of his that made a person feel like the only thing in the world worth studying. "I will come guard your herd, Margaret Easton, and I will do what I can about that pass, because it is the right thing to do, and because Cornelius Vance is exactly the kind of man who needs somebody standing in his way. I want to be honest with you about the rest of it too, before I ever set foot on your land again. I do not know what is left between us after 8 years, but I would like the chance to find out if you will let me have it." Margaret Easton, who had not let herself want anything simple and personal for 3 years of fighting to keep a ranch solvent, found that she did not have a ready answer for that kind of honesty, and so she said the only true thing available to her. "Come guard my herd, Amos Covington. We will see what else there is to find." He arrived at the Easton Ranch 2 days later with a string of 4 horses he had gentled himself, riding a big gray mare named Dinah that moved like poured water, and Margaret watched from the porch as Refugio's whole crew came out to see him, because word traveled fast in ranch country, and everyone had heard the name Amos Covington attached now to stories that had grown taller with every telling. He did not look like the stories, she thought, watching him swing down from the saddle. He looked like a tired man who was good with horses and careful with his words, and it was 3 days before she understood that both things could be true at once. The gentle horseman and the man other men were afraid to cross, folded together in the same quiet frame. The gathering went on. 900 head of cattle scattered across 11,000 acres of high desert grass and arroyo brush had to be found, sorted, branded where the spring calves needed it, and held ready for the drive to the railhead that would come after the election settled whatever it was going to settle. It was hard, dusty, unglamorous work, and Amos did his full share of it alongside Refugio and Manuel and the other hands, and Margaret found herself, against every intention of keeping matters strictly business, watching him at it more than she meant to. He had a way with the young stock that she had never seen in another cowhand. A skittish heifer that would have taken 3 men and a length of rope to subdue for branding under Manuel's method would stand, trembling but still, under Amos's low, steady voice and slow hands, and come away from the iron with less fright in her eyes than she had gone in with. He did not believe in breaking an animal's spirit to make it obedient. He told Margaret one evening as they rode the fence line together checking for gaps Vance's men might use, and she thought there was something else in the words besides horse sense, some old wound of his own he was talking around. "My father broke horses the hard way," he said, when she asked him about it directly, because 8 years apart had at least taught her the value of asking directly for things she wanted to know. Rope and force, and wear the fight out of them until they gave up. I used to think that was just how it was done, until I saw an old Comanche horseman work a herd once when I was 14, down near the Canadian River, and he never raised his voice above a murmur and never once needed to. Took me another 10 years to unlearn everything my father taught me and learn it his way instead. He was quiet a moment, looking out at the mesa gone gold in the last light. "A frightened animal is not disobedient, Margaret. It is scared, and it has good reason usually, and if you can convince it the fear does not have to run its whole life, it will follow you anywhere. Is that a lesson about horses, Amos Covington, or is it a lesson about something else?" He looked at her sideways, and there was that ghost of a smile again, more of it this time. "Might be both. I have found most good lessons work that way." It was 4 nights later that Vance's men made their move against the herd, and it came the way Margaret had half expected it would. At night, in the dark hour before dawn when a cowhand's alertness is at its lowest ebb, 6 riders coming in from the northeast, with torches and gunfire, meant to spook 900 head of half-wild cattle into a stampede that would scatter them across the mesa for days of exhausting, dangerous recovery, and might well run some of them straight off the edge of the Rio Verde bluffs to their deaths in the bargain. Margaret woke to the sound of gunfire and was dressed and out the door with her rifle before she had fully separated the sound from her dreams. Amos was already ahorse, she saw by the light of the rising moon, already moving toward the herd at a dead run on the gray mare, and she caught up her own horse and followed with her heart hammering against her ribs. What she found at the herd ground was chaos held one breath short of catastrophe. The cattle bunched and bawling, and beginning to mill in the dangerous circular pattern that preceded a full stampede. 3 advances, riders whooping and firing pistols into the air at the herd's edge to drive the panic higher, and Amos Covington riding directly into the heart of the frightened mass of animals, as though he had no fear of 900 half-ton beasts about to run mindless in every direction at once. "Get to the front, turn the leaders," he shouted to Refugio, who was already spurring hard toward the herd's forward edge. And then Amos did something that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. He began to sing, low and clear, some old trail song about the Brazos River that carried over the bawling and the gunfire in a voice pitched exactly for cattle ears, calm and unhurried and utterly without fear. And the animals nearest him began, incredibly, to slow. Margaret put her own horse toward the raiders, not the herd, because she understood in that instant that the men causing the panic mattered more right now than the panic itself. She fired once into the air above the nearest rider's head, close enough that he felt the wind of it, and shouted with all the authority she could put into her voice, "Get off my range, or the next one comes lower." The rider spun his horse, saw a woman with a rifle who plainly meant business, and made the same calculation Coy Dalton's men had made at her gate 9 days before. He shouted something to his companions, and the 3 of them wheeled and rode hard back toward the northeast, their torches guttering out behind them as they went, leaving the herd still frightened but no longer under direct assault. It took another hour of careful, patient work, most of it Amos's low singing and Refugio's steady hands, to settle the cattle back into their loose grazing pattern and confirm that none had gone over the bluffs in the dark. When it was finally done, gray dawn breaking over the mesa, Margaret found herself standing beside her horse with her legs shaking from more than exertion, and Amos came to stand beside her, breathing hard, a shallow cut along one cheekbone from a branch he had ridden through in the dark. "You are bleeding," she said, and reached up without thinking about it to touch the cut, and felt him go very still under her fingers. "It is nothing." His voice had gone rough. "Margaret, that was a foolish risk you took, riding at armed men with nothing but a rifle and your nerve. It is my herd, Amos, my father's herd, that I have kept alive through 3 years of drought and debt, while every rancher in this county waited for me to fail so they could buy the water rights out from under me. I do not intend to lose it to Cornelius Vance's hired bullies now. I know it." He caught her hand where it still rested near his jaw, not pulling it away, just holding it there a moment, his thumb tracing once, gently, across her knuckles. "I am not telling you to be less brave. I am telling you that I would take considerable trouble losing you after only just getting you back." The words hung there between them in the cold, clean light of dawn, and Margaret felt something in her chest that she had not let herself feel in longer than she wanted to admit, something warm and frightening in equal measure, and she did not pull her hand away either. "We should get back," she said finally, though she made no move to do so. "Refugio will need help with the count." "He will." Amos did not move either. In a minute. It was 3 more days before they found the evidence that changed everything about what they were facing. And it came about because Amos, restless after the failed night raid on the herd, took it on himself to scout the country between the Easton Ranch and Vance's spread, wanting to understand the ground before the ballot boxes made their journey through Canyon Angosto. He came back at dusk with a look on his face that Margaret had not seen there before, something between grim satisfaction and outright alarm, and a leather satchel he had taken off a man he did not name, though she suspected from the careful way he described the encounter, with no mention of gunfire, that he had gotten it through patience and misdirection rather than force, exactly the way he handled a frightened horse. "I found their camp in the Box Canyon behind the old Suarez homestead," he told her, spreading the satchel's contents across the kitchen table while Consuelo hovered nearby with a lantern. Coy Dalton and 4 others, and this satchel sitting in a supply wagon that I do not think anyone was meant to look inside. The satchel held perhaps 200 blank ballot forms, printed with the exact seal of the county clerk's office, and a letter in a careful clerkish hand that made Margaret's blood run cold as she read it by lantern light. "It is from Otis Prine," she said slowly, reading the signature at the bottom. "The county clerk himself. Amos, this is not simply Vance's men trying to frighten voters or steal boxes in the pass. Prine intends to have these blank ballots pre-marked for Vance's candidate and substituted for the real boxes from the precincts most likely to vote for Elijah Ford before the official count ever happens. The pass is only part of it. If they cannot manage the theft in the canyon, they mean to do the substitution right in the clerk's own office, where no one would think to look. Then we need more than a fight at the pass," Amos said, his jaw tight. "We need proof of this, put in front of people who will believe it before Election Day." "Elijah Ford," Margaret said immediately. "He is running honest against Vance's man, Whit Sumner, and half the ranchers in this county trust him. If we bring this to him, and to enough witnesses that Prine and Vance cannot simply deny it, we will need to move carefully. If Dalton discovers this satchel is missing before we can act, they will change their plan, and we lose our proof along with the advantage of surprise." They left the next morning before first light, the 2 of them alone, because Margaret judged that a larger party would draw attention they could not afford, and because, she admitted to herself if not quite to Amos, she wanted the chance to be alone with him after the strange charged moment at the herd ground 3 nights before. They rode north toward Elijah Ford spread near the mouth of the canyon, following the old wagon track that wound along the Rio Verde's western bank, the satchel of evidence wrapped in oilcloth and buried deep in Margaret's saddlebag. The spring weather in the high desert country, so reliable in its sunlit mornings, turned on them without warning somewhere past midday. A bank of dark cloud came rolling down off the mountains with a speed that spoke of the season's unpredictable temper, and within the hour they were riding through a cold, driving rain that turned the dry arroyo bottoms into sudden treacherous streams and cut visibility to a few dozen yards in every direction. "We cannot cross the Rio Verde in this," Amos shouted over the wind, watching the normally placid river below them already beginning to run brown and fast with runoff. "It will be a torrent within the hour if this keeps up. There is an old line shack up this draw, half a mile. I noticed it when I scouted this country. We should shelter there until it breaks." They found the shack exactly where Amos remembered it, a small stone and timber structure built decades before by some long-gone sheepherder, with a sound roof if a leaky one and a stone hearth that still drew, and they got the horses under the lean-to attached to its side, and themselves inside just as the rain turned to a genuine downpour that hammered the roof like a drumbeat. They were both soaked through, and there was, Margaret discovered with some embarrassment, exactly 1 dry blanket in the shack's meager stores, left there by some previous traveler and forgotten, along with a small stock of dry kindling that Amos coaxed into a fire with the same patient economy he brought to everything. "You should get out of that wet dress before you catch your death," he said, not looking at her, busying himself with the fire in a way that told her he was giving her whatever privacy the small space allowed. "There is a blanket. I will keep my back turned." She changed behind the makeshift screen of her own saddle blanket hung over a peg, wrapping herself in the dry wool, and when she was decent she found Amos had stripped off his own soaked shirt and was sitting close to the growing fire in his undershirt, his skin marked here and there with the small scars of a hard-used life, and she found she could not stop herself from looking. "You are staring, Margaret Easton." He said it without heat, almost amused. "I am cataloging your injuries, Mr. Covington, in case I ever need to identify you by them." But her voice had gone soft, and he heard it, and looked up at her with an expression that made the small stone room feel considerably warmer than the fire alone could account for. "There is a story behind most of them," he said, None of them worth telling tonight if it is all the same to you. I would rather hear about the last 8 years of your life than talk about mine." So she told him. She told him about her father's slow decline, about the drought years that had nearly broken the ranch before she had ever gotten the chance to prove herself capable of saving it, about the 3 separate marriage proposals from neighboring ranchers she had refused, because every one of them had wanted the Easton water rights considerably more than they had wanted her, about the particular loneliness of being a woman who ran her own outfit in a country that expected women to be someone's wife and nothing more. "I used to think about you," she admitted, the fire popping softly between them, the rain still drumming steady overhead. "More than I let myself say, even to myself. I told myself you had simply ridden off and forgotten Alma Springs entirely, made yourself a new life somewhere that did not include me. It was easier to be angry about that than to admit I missed you. I never forgot you, Margaret, not one day of those 8 years." He said it simply, without any performance in it, which made it land all the harder. "I told myself the same kind of lie, that I had left you behind along with everything else about that life, and it was never true either. I thought about writing you 100 times. I never had the courage to do it because I did not know what I would say that was worth the paper. A man with blood on his hands and no ranch and no prospects, writing to the daughter of Josiah Easton. My father is not here to object any more, Amos. No." He looked at her steadily across the small fire. "But I am still the same man, more or less. Better with horses than I was, worse rested than I was, with more men's deaths sitting on my conscience than any man ought to carry. I do not know that I am a better prospect now than I was then. You saved my herd 4 nights ago. You have ridden into danger twice now on my account without a moment's hesitation, and you have never once made me feel like anything less than capable of standing beside you rather than behind you. I do not need a prospect, Amos Covington. I have a ranch and a herd and more work than any 10 men could finish. What I do not have, and have not had in longer than I want to say, is somebody who sees all of that and is not either frightened off by it or trying to take it away from me for himself." Her voice caught slightly. "I think that might be worth more than any prospect." He reached across the small space between them and took her hand, the same gesture as at the herd ground, but slower this time, more deliberate, and when she did not pull away, he brought it to his lips and kissed her knuckles with a gentleness that made her breath catch in her throat. "Margaret!" Her name in his mouth sounded like something being carefully unwrapped. "I do not want to make you any promise I am not certain I can keep, not with Vance and this election still ahead of us, and no guarantee either of us comes through it clean. But I want you to know that whatever happens at that pass, whatever happens between now and Election Day, I am not leaving Alma Springs again unless you send me away yourself. I am not going to send you away, Amos." She leaned across the fire's small warmth and kissed him, soft and searching, 8 years of unspoken feeling finding its way finally into something real, and he made a low sound against her mouth and gathered her closer, one hand coming up to cradle the back of her head with a tenderness that belied every hard thing the world had ever asked of those same hands. They stayed that way a long while, wrapped together against the cold and the rain, talking in low voices about small things and large ones, about horses and cattle, and the particular color the mesa turned at sunset in October, about what a life might look like if 2 stubborn, capable, lonely people decided to stop being lonely together. It was near midnight before the rain finally broke, and the stars came out hard and bright over the wet mesa, and they slept that night curled together for warmth on the narrow shack floor, nothing more than that. But it was enough, Margaret thought as she drifted toward sleep with Amos's arm solid around her, to feel like the beginning of everything she had stopped letting herself hope for. They reached Elijah Ford's ranch the following afternoon, the country washed clean and green from the storm, wildflowers already pushing up gold and purple through the wet grass along the trail, and found Ford himself, a broad, steady man of 50 with a face weathered like old saddle leather, deeply troubled by what the satchel of evidence revealed. Otis Prine, Ford said heavily, reading the letter through twice as if hoping the words might change on a second look. I have known that man 20 years. I would not have believed it of him. Vance holds paper on half the town, Mr. Ford, Amos said. Man like Prine, with a clerk's salary and children to feed, might find himself agreeing to things he would never have chosen on his own, once the threat of losing his position or his home gets put plain in front of him. That does not excuse it, but I take your meaning. Ford set the letter down and looked at the two of them with new appraisal. This is not enough on its own, you understand. Vance will simply claim the letter is a forgery, that you stole it to discredit an honest man. We need to catch them in the act, or find enough witnesses that denial becomes impossible. Then we need to know exactly how they intend to move, Margaret said. The ballot boxes travel through Canyon Angosto to the county seat for counting after the polls close. If we can arrange for enough honest men to be present at that crossing, and enough witnesses from every precinct, Vance's men cannot simply seize the boxes without half the county watching it happen. Ford was quiet a long moment, turning that over. There is a gathering planned in Alma Springs the evening before the election, a sort of last rally for both candidates, as is traditional. If we could get word to every rancher and homesteader along the Rio Verde to bring their families to town for the vote and stay through the counting, rather than voting early at their home precincts and riding off before the count, Vance would have a harder time managing things quietly. A crowd is a poor place to commit a theft nobody is meant to see. Sheriff Hollies, Margaret said slowly. Jed Whitfield believes he is frightened rather than complicit. If we could bring him this evidence privately, give him the chance to do his duty with the weight of witnesses behind him, rather than standing alone against Vance. It is worth trying, Amos said. A frightened man is not the same as a corrupt one, and a frightened man given enough allies sometimes finds his courage. They spent the 4 days remaining before the election in careful, unglamorous work that Margaret would later think mattered every bit as much as anything that happened at the pass itself. Riding the length of the Rio Verde Valley with Elijah Ford, calling on ranch families and homesteaders, and the handful of merchants in Alma Springs, laying out quietly and without exaggeration what they had found and what they feared, and asking each one of them to do a simple thing that cost them little but courage. Come to town for the count and stay. The response surprised Margaret with its steadiness. She had expected fear, reluctance, the kind of quiet accommodation to power that had let Cornelius Vance grow as large as he had grown in this county. Instead, she found neighbors who had watched Vance's men ride roughshod over the range for 2 years, who had lost calves to his rustling and water to his diversions and dignity to his casual cruelty, and who were, it turned out, simply waiting for somebody to stand up first and show them it could be done. Sheriff Wyatt Hollies received them in his office 2 days before the election with the wary look of a man who suspected trouble was coming and had hoped he might avoid being the one who had to deal with it. He was younger than Margaret expected, no more than 35, with an earnest if exhausted face, and when Amos laid Otis Prine's letter on his desk along with the satchel of blank ballots, Hollies went pale and then, slowly, angry. I suspected something was wrong, he admitted, running a hand over his face. Prine has been strange with me for weeks, will not meet my eye. I did not want to believe Vance had gotten to him. I did not want to believe I would have to do something about it if he had, if I am honest with you, because Vance holds my brother's note on his feed store, and I have let myself pretend that was not the same as being bought. It is not too late to be the man your badge says you are, Sheriff, Margaret said, not unkindly. But it will take more courage now than it would have taken a month ago, because now there will be witnesses either way. Hollies looked at the letter a long time. What do you need from me? Deputies at Canyon Angosto when the boxes move, Amos said, and your presence at the count itself in Alma Springs publicly, standing for an honest tally regardless of who it favors. If Vance's men see the sheriff himself will not look away, some of them may lose their appetite for the fight before it starts. And Otis Prine, give him the chance to come forward himself before the count, Margaret said. A frightened man told plainly that his crime is already known, and offered the choice between confession and ruin, will very often choose confession. It costs us nothing to offer it, and it may save us a harder fight. Election day dawned clear and cold, the last of the spring rains having scoured the sky to a hard, bright blue, and by mid-morning the road into Alma Springs was thick with wagons and riders coming in from every ranch and homestead along the Rio Verde Valley. More people than Margaret had ever seen gathered in the little town at once. Word had traveled, in the particular way that important news always traveled in ranch country, faster and further than anyone had directly spread it, and it seemed that every family within 20 miles had decided this was an election worth staying to watch counted honestly. The polling went smoothly enough through the day, ballots cast at the schoolhouse under the watchful eyes of election judges from both camps, but everyone understood the real test would come at dusk, when the boxes from the outlying precincts had to be gathered and carried through Canyon Angosto, the single narrow pass through the rocky shoulder of mountain that separated the town's polling place from the county seat where the official count would be certified, 12 miles distant. Cornelius Vance himself came to observe the box's departure, a tall, spare man with silver hair and cold, pale eyes, dressed like a banker rather than a rancher, and Margaret felt the full weight of his attention when he found her standing near the wagon that would carry the ballot boxes, Amos at her side with his hand resting easy but ready near his holster. "Miss Easton." Vance's voice was smooth, cultured, entirely at odds with the violence his men had brought to her ranch. "I understand you have taken quite an interest in this election, unusual for a woman with a herd to manage." "I have taken an interest in honest government, Mr. Vance, same as any citizen with a stake in this county's future." "And you, Mr. Covington?" Vance turned that cold gaze on Amos. "I had heard you preferred horses to politics these days. A man of your particular talents could find considerably more profitable employment than guarding a widow's cattle, if he were willing to consider where his loyalties might be best rewarded." "I am not for sale, Mr. Vance, and Miss Easton is not a widow. She is an independent woman who has outrun and outworked every rival ranch in this county, including yours, which I suspect is closer to the trouble between you than any concern for honest elections." Amos's voice stayed level, but there was steel under it now. "I would advise your men to let those boxes travel that pass without interference. There are a good many witnesses today who would take a very dim view of anyone who tried otherwise." Vance's smile did not falter, but something behind his eyes went flat and calculating. "We shall see what the road offers, Mr. Covington. Roads through mountain country can be unpredictable this time of year. Rockslides, washouts, all manner of unfortunate accident." He turned and walked away, and Margaret felt the cold certainty settle over her that whatever Vance intended, he intended it at the pass, and soon. The ballot wagon set out from Alma Springs an hour before sunset, escorted by Sheriff Hollies and 2 deputies, with Elijah Ford riding alongside as the losing or winning candidate's right to observe, and behind them, in a procession that had assembled itself with no formal organization at all but simple shared purpose, perhaps 40 ranchers and homesteaders on horseback and in wagons, families included, come to see for themselves that the count would travel safely to where it needed to go. Margaret and Amos rode near the front, close by the wagon, and as the procession approached the mouth of Canyon Angosto in the long gold light of evening, Margaret felt every nerve in her body drawn tight as wire. The canyon was a narrow defile perhaps 200 yards long, its walls rising sheer on either side, the only crossing of the Rio Verde Gorge for 15 miles in either direction, and thus the single unavoidable chokepoint through which anything traveling between Alma Springs and the county seat had to pass. It was, Margaret understood with sudden clarity as they approached it, exactly the kind of place a man like Cornelius Vance would choose if he meant to seize something by force and needed a location where he could control who came and went. They found Coy Dalton and perhaps a dozen riders waiting at the canyon's mouth, blocking the trail entirely, rifles held ready but not yet raised, and Margaret's heart dropped at the sight of the numbers arrayed against them, more men than she had expected Vance to risk in the open like this. "That is far enough," Dalton called out, his voice carrying easy across the still evening air. "Sheriff, you and your deputies can pass. The rest of this crowd needs to turn back to town. No cause for half the county to go traipsing through the canyon at dusk. These boxes are county property, Dalton, and I'm escorting them to certification same as the law requires," Hollis called back, and Margaret was gratified to hear real steel in the young sheriff's voice, the sound of a man who had finally decided which side of his own conscience he intended to stand on. "These citizens have every right to observe. Mr. Vance feels differently." "Mr. Vance does not make the law in this county, whatever he may believe," Hollis said, and nudged his horse forward. What happened next happened fast, the way real danger always seemed to happen faster than a person could properly think through it. Dalton raised his rifle, not aimed at anyone directly but as a clear signal to his men, and half a dozen of them spurred their horses forward to physically block the wagon's path, shouting, trying to seize the lead horse's bridle. And for one heart-stopping moment Margaret thought the whole confrontation was about to collapse into exactly the kind of violent chaos that would let Vance claim afterward that the boxes had been lost or destroyed in an unfortunate melee nobody could fairly blame him for. It was Amos who kept it from becoming that. He rode forward, not toward the men grabbing at the wagon horse, but directly between the two groups, positioning his gray mare broadside across the trail in a way that put his own body between the drawn rifles and the crowd of families behind him. And he raised both hands, empty, visible, and pitched his voice the same way he pitched it to a frightened animal, low and clear and utterly without panic in it. "There are 40 witnesses on this trail, Dalton, families with children among them, and every one of them will testify at whatever hearing follows if a single shot gets fired here today. You do not want that on your account, and I do not believe Cornelius Vance wants it on his either, not with his name already tied to bribery and forged ballots that half this county has already seen with their own eyes." He let that settle a moment, watching the uncertainty ripple through Dalton's riders, men who had signed on for intimidation and easy money, and had perhaps not fully reckoned on the prospect of gunning down neighbors in front of their own wives and children. Elijah Ford has a copy of Otis Prine's letter, already delivered to a lawyer in Santa Fe, with instructions to make it public regardless of what happens here today. Seizing these boxes will not save Vance's man the election. It will only add armed robbery and possibly murder to the account he already has to answer for. Dalton's rifle wavered. Margaret saw it, the small hesitation, and understood that this was the moment that would decide everything. And so she did the thing that felt most true to who she had become across 3 hard years of holding her own ranch together against long odds. She rode forward to sit her horse beside Amos, in plain sight of every rifle on that trail, and added her own voice to his. "Coy Dalton, you have ridden onto my land twice now trying to frighten a woman out of her own herd, and both times you rode away because you knew, underneath all your bluster, that you did not actually want the fight enough to see it through. I do not believe you want this fight either. Put down your rifle and let these boxes pass, and I give you my word that whatever happens to Cornelius Vance, nobody here will hold you personally responsible for following a bad man's orders, provided you stop following them right now." The silence stretched. Somewhere behind them, a child, held on her mother's hip in one of the wagons, began to cry, a small human sound that seemed to break something in the tension hanging over the canyon mouth. And then, slowly, Coy Dalton lowered his rifle. "This was not worth what he is paying," Dalton said, more to himself than to anyone else, and one by one his riders followed his lead, lowering their weapons, backing their horses off the trail, until the way through Canyon Angosto stood open and clear in the last gold light of the day. The ballot boxes reached the county seat that night without further incident, escorted the entire 12 miles by the strange impromptu procession of 40 families who had refused to be frightened off the road, and were certified the following morning under the eyes of enough witnesses that no question of tampering could ever seriously be raised against the count. Elijah Ford won the county commissioner's seat by a margin that would have been comfortable even without the votes from the precincts Vance had hoped to steal, a clear and unambiguous verdict from the people of the county. Otis Prine, faced with the letter's public exposure and the testimony of witnesses at the pass, resigned his position within the week and left the territory rather than face prosecution, which Sheriff Hollies, now considerably more confident in the exercise of his own office, made clear he was fully prepared to pursue. Cornelius Vance himself, stripped of his hoped-for influence over the county government and facing a growing chorus of former allies who had discovered, in the safety of Ford's victory, that they had never much liked him anyway, sold his ranch within the month to a cattle syndicate out of Kansas, and departed New Mexico territory for reasons he did not trouble to explain to anyone who had once called him neighbor. Coy Dalton, to Margaret's considerable surprise, showed up at the Easton Ranch 3 weeks after the election looking for honest work, admitting plainly that he had done things in Vance's employ he was not proud of, and hoping a fair outfit might give him the chance to do better. Margaret, remembering the moment at Canyon Angosto when he had chosen, in the end, not to fire, and remembering also Amos's philosophy about frightened creatures given the chance to trust something better than their fear, took him on as a hand, and never once regretted it. But it was the quieter aftermath, the weeks that followed the election's resolution, that mattered most to Margaret, because it was in those slower days, with the herd safely gathered and branded, and the range finally at peace, that she and Amos Covington built something between them that felt less like the sudden fire of danger shared, and more like the steady warmth of a life being deliberately chosen. He did not leave the ranch after the election, though there was no longer any pretense of hired protection needed to justify his staying. He simply stayed, working the horses, riding the fence lines, sitting with her on the porch in the long spring evenings while the wildflowers that had come up so thick after the rains began to give way to the first real heat of approaching summer. And one evening in early June, with the sky gone the particular deep purple that came just after sunset in that high desert country, he took her hand on the porch steps and asked her the question she had, if she was honest with herself. Been hoping he would ask since that night in the line shack. I do not have much to offer you that you do not already have more of yourself, Margaret Easton. You have a ranch and a herd and more capability in your own 2 hands than any 3 men I have worked beside. But I have got a gift for gentling frightened things, horse or otherwise, and a whole heart that has been yours, if I am honest, since I was 23 years old and too foolish and too poor to say so plainly. I am asking you now, with no father left to forbid it and no reputation left to hide behind, if you would consider making a life with me, not because you need protecting, because I would like the chance to stand beside you for the rest of both our lives, guarding whatever needs guarding together. Margaret, who had spent 3 years telling herself she needed nothing and no one to prove her own worth, found that the truth of her heart had never actually required her to be alone to be strong, and that the bravest thing available to her now was not refusing this offered warmth but accepting it with both hands. Yes, Amos. I have been waiting a long while to say that to you, whether I let myself admit it or not. They were married in August, in the small adobe church in Alma Springs, with Refugio standing as witness for Amos, who had no family left in the territory to call on, and Consuelo weeping happy tears through the whole brief ceremony, and half the county turning out afterward for a celebration on the Easton Ranch that ran long into the warm summer night. Fiddle music and dancing and more good Well, then Margaret had seen gathered in one place in all her years running that hard, beautiful land. They did not simply fold Amos into the existing Easton outfit, though that would have been the easier path. Instead, they built something new between them over the following year, a horse training operation set up on 40 acres of the ranch's western pasture, where Amos could gentle green stock for sale to the growing ranches of the valley. Feeding directly into the cattle operation, Margaret continued to run with the same fierce competence that had kept it alive through the hardest years, the two businesses supporting each other the way the two of them had learned to support one another. Not one leaning on the other, but both standing stronger for standing together. They called it Easton and Covington, painted plain on a new sign at the ranch gate, and it became known across that stretch of New Mexico territory as the place to bring a frightened, ruined horse and trust that it would come away gentled, and the place to trust that an honest count would be kept of whatever needed counting, cattle or otherwise, because Margaret Easton had never once in her life allowed a false tally to stand unchallenged, and everyone in the county had, by then, good reason to know it. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the herd was settled, and the horses in the training pens had gone still and easy for the night, Margaret and Amos would sit together on the porch that had once belonged only to her, watching the last light fade gold and then purple over the mesa. And she would think, sometimes, of that terrible dawn when a wounded boy had ridden into her yard with half a warning on his lips, and how strange it was that such a dark beginning had led her by the winding paths a hard country sometimes offered, to exactly the kind of steady, chosen love she had stopped believing she would ever find. "Any regrets, Margaret Easton?" Amos asked her once, months into their marriage, his arm warm around her shoulders in the cooling evening air. "Only that I did not send for you sooner," she told him, and meant it entirely, and turned her face up to his for a kiss that held in it all the hard-won peace of two capable, once lonely people who had finally found, in each other, the safest place either of them had ever known.